of the hands came fast, both of them. Around her throat she didn't flinch. 40 pounds of pressure, maybe more. The kind of grip that collapses windpipes and ends arguments permanently. The kind that says, I have done this before, and I will do it again, and no one will stop me. She let him think that. Her pulse didn't spike, didn't race, didn't do what a normal person's pulse does when someone is actively trying to kill them. 62 beats per minute. Steady, measured, of. The same rhythm she'd held in places this man couldn't pronounce. Through firefights, through ambushes, through the kind of darkness that rewires a person permanently. She was already past the fear. She was already somewhere else entirely. Of her eyes moved once, slow, deliberate, to the northeast corner of the room, the red light still blinking, still recording. She almost smiled. 3 men in this room. 1 general's worth of anger pressing against her throat. And not one of them understood what they had actually walked into. Not yet. Her left hand shifted. Barely. Almost nothing. Just 2 fingers adjusting against his wrist. The man holding her throat had no idea. He was 3 seconds away from the worst mistake of his military career. And she was going to let him make it on camera. Of the government van that carried Maren Reeve to FOB Iron was the color of old bone and covered in enough desert dust to write your name in, unmarked. Military issue, of the kind of vehicle that says nothing to see here so loudly that anyone paying attention knows immediately there is something to see here. The driver was a specialist who looked barely old enough to rent a car. Smart enough not to ask questions. Of Maren sat in the back and watched the Nevada desert pass. Scrub brush. Joshua trees throwing long morning shadows. The sun already punishing at 0800, the way it got out here by mid-morning without apology. Of she'd deployed to worse places. She thought about the list instead. 18 months. That was the assignment. Locate the security vulnerabilities in FOB Iron. File the reports. And. This was the part nobody had put in writing. Find out where $412,000 in equipment funds had disappeared to over the past 14 months. Someone inside this base was stealing. Quietly, methodically. Of the kind of theft that only works when the thief understands the system well enough to hide inside it. JSOC had been watching the pattern for 6 months before they sent her. Waiting until the amounts were large enough to justify the exposure. Of waiting until they had someone they trusted enough to insert quietly. They sent her. 18 months. Then Florida. A small boat. Sunscreen. Sandals. Nothing with rank insignia. She had told herself this before. Of over harder things than Nevada. The gate guard checked her credentials 3 times. Made a phone call. Made another one. Then waved her through with the expression of a man who had just been told to ask 0 follow-up questions and was actively working on his facial neutrality. Smart kid. Of her quarters were exactly what she expected. 8 by 10. Metal bunk. Metal desk. Metal locker. 1 window overlooking the training ground. Of a light fixture that flickered every 40 seconds with the specific rhythm of something that had given up trying to be reliable. She dropped her duffel and stood still for a moment, taking in the room the way Harlan Cole had taught her to take in every room since she was 22 years old. Know your exits before you need them. Know the geometry of any space you inhabit. Of don't be the person who has to figure it out under pressure. Window. West-facing. 2nd floor. Drop. Manageable. Door. Standard hinge. Opens inward. Camera in the hallway angled toward the stairwell. Blind spot 4 feet left of her door. Of good. She unpacked methodically. 3 uniforms folded with creases sharp enough to cut. Personal kit aligned on the desk. And then, more carefully than anything else, the photograph. Nathan, 36 years old in this picture. Of dress blues. That specific grin he got when he thought he was the smartest person in the room. Which was most of the time. Because he usually was. She centered the frame. Exactly centered. Hey baby. Quiet. Just to the room. To whatever remained when someone you loved was gone. 18 months. Then I'm out. I promise. His dog tags came next. She hung them from the corner of the frame. Metal cool from being carried in her bag. Last, the notebook, leather-bound, of worn soft with years of cargo pockets. She opened it to the inside cover. 190 small marks cut into the leather. Each one a mission. Each one a choice made at the far edge of what human beings are capable of doing to each other and to themselves. She closed it without counting. She already knew the number. Of General Gideon Harmon, looked like a man who had made peace with too much coffee and not enough sleep 30 years ago and never revisited the decision. 57. Gulf War. Of. The face of someone who had been carrying irreversible decisions long enough that they had become simply part of his structure rather than a weight on top of it. He looked up when she knocked. Sting, "Sir, sit down." "Close the door." She did, of spine straight. Hands in her lap, Harmon studied her. "Your file," he said, "is the most aggressively redacted document I've encountered in 29 years of command." He leaned back. "Technical advisor. Communications systems integration of." "That's my assignment, sir." "That's a cover story. Flat. Not unkind, just accurate. The network security assessment is real. You'll do it. File the reports. Look the part." He pushed a thin folder across the desk. "Of. But that's not why Jasak requested you specifically." She looked at the folder without touching it. $412,000. 14 months. Increments small enough to avoid the automatic audit threshold. Of. His jaw tightened. "We've been watching the pattern for 6 months, waiting until we had a clear enough picture, and someone we trusted enough to insert quietly." "Internal access," she said. "Someone with internal access, accounting knowledge, of insufficient rank to authorize transfers without secondary approval." He met her eyes. "You find the thread. Pull it carefully. Bring me the end." "Understood, sir. Your cover stays intact. No one knows." "Not the XO? Not JAG?" He paused. "Of one more thing. Major Beckett Hargrove. A company ranger. His people are good, he is." Another pause. "He carries some history with Navy units. Be prepared, I can handle Army Rangers." "Sir," something crossed his face. Almost a smile. "Of I know you can." "Dismissed, Master Chief." She stood. Saluted. Sting, she stopped. "Don't let this place do what Kandahar couldn't." He said it quietly. Like he meant it. "No, sir." Of the chow hall smelled like burned coffee and the particular optimism of institutional food service that has long since stopped expecting gratitude. Maren moved through the serving line. Oatmeal, black coffee, a banana, of the diet of someone who had stopped treating food as pleasure and started treating it as maintenance approximately 15 years ago. She found a corner table, set her tray down, sat with her back to the wall, old habit, non-negotiable, and ate. Of she was 3 spoonfuls in when she saw him. Kenter table. Laughing. The body language of a man who commanded a room by existing in it rather than demanding it. She'd reviewed the roster yesterday. Major Beckett Hargrove, of 38 years old. Army Ranger, multiple tours. Designated marksman, Bronze Star with Valor. The kind of file that said, "This man is good at what he does, and he knows it." But she wasn't thinking about his file. She was thinking about his face, the jaw, the set of his shoulders, the particular intensity in his eyes even across a crowded room. The way he laughed, brief, controlled, never quite fully. She had seen that face before, not his, of the one that made his. She looked down at her oatmeal, breathed in, slow, held it, let it out, and remembered. Of Iraq. March 21, 2003, she was 22 years old, and it was her first night outside the wire on a real operation, and the desert was cold enough at 3 in the morning that her hands shook. She'd told herself it was from the cold. If it wasn't from the cold, Colonel Warren Hargrove was 44, Army Forward Air Controller. Chest full of ribbons. The kind of presence that made young operators feel, improbably, like things might be okay. He'd looked at her in that first hour, young, female, clearly terrified under her game face, and said, "You good, petty officer?" "Good, sir." He'd nodded. Not skeptical, not condescending. Just accepted it. Good. Then the world exploded. Of RPGs, mortars, AK fire from positions intelligence had sworn were empty. Everything at once. Cole on the radio. Maren already moving. Center mass. Breathe. Squeeze. Then the mortar 15 feet from Hargrove. She reached him in 11 seconds. His right leg was wrong. The femur, shattered. Blood, too much, arterial bad, and she had the tourniquet out before she finished the thought. "Stay with me, sir." His eyes found hers. Present, of calm in a way that cost him something. "Am I going to die?" "Tighter, tighter. Come on." "Not if I have anything to say about it, sir." Cole was on the radio. Medevac inbound. 12 minutes. A long time. Warren Hargrove grabbed her hand. Of his grip already weakening. "My boy." Beckett, a breath. Labored. "He's 17. Tell him I'm proud. Tell him to live better than me." "You're going to tell him yourself, sir." "No," said it quietly. Certain. The peace of someone who knows. Of no, I'm not. His eyes on hers. "But you are. I can see it." She was still pressing, still trying. The Black Hawk came. They loaded him. She held his hand until they took him from her. The crew chief worked fast. IV lines, pressure bandages, the controlled chaos of people trying hard to win an argument with death. And then the crew chief looked at her, shook his head. The helicopter lifted off. She stood in the rotor wash, covered in Warren Hargrove's blood, and she made a promise, silent, specific, absolute, that she was going to find his son. Deliver that message, because this man had deserved more than a form letter and a folded flag. 2 weeks later, she filed the formal request of official channels. Please authorize contact with next of kin of KIA Colonel Warren Hargrove. Message from Final Moments, the response. Request denied. Classified mission parameters. She tried 3 more times. 3 more denials. And Beckett Hargrove had been 17 years old, and his father was gone. And Maren Reeve had his last words and could not reach him. For 20 years she had carried that. Now she was looking at his face across a chow hall in Nevada, and he had no idea who she was. She finished her breakfast, cleaned her tray, left without looking at him again. Behind her, his laughter echoed off the walls, easy, loud, the laughter of a man who hadn't yet seen what she'd seen in that room. The work started the same afternoon. She found the first security vulnerability on day 2, a firewall misconfiguration so fundamental it made her tired just looking at it. Day 3, radio encryption running 2 generations out of date. Day 4, physical access points a motivated teenager could breach in 11 minutes. She documented everything, filed reports, sent them up the chain. What she was also doing, quietly underneath, was pulling the financial records. 14 months of equipment fund transactions, small amounts, regular intervals, of different account codes each time. Whoever was doing this understood the system's audit architecture intimately. They were hiding inside the noise of a functioning military base. Routine purchases, routine authorizations, of camouflage built from familiarity. Smart, but not airtight. Nothing was airtight. There was always a thread. She pulled threads in the evenings, after the official work, after maintenance, before the dreams that came whether she invited them or not. She also noticed Petra Voss, 22 years old, private first class, sharp-eyed, small, trying to take up as little space as possible while being clearly capable of taking up more. She sat alone at breakfast every morning, not by choice. Maren could read the difference after 21 years. Petra sat alone because when she tried to sit with people, something happened. A moved tray, a conversation that shifted, a laugh a half-second too pointed. Hargrove's unit. Not direct, probably not conscious, but the culture of a group flows from its leader. And somewhere along the way, this young woman had been decided against. Maren, watch this. Filed it. Did nothing. Not yet. The range was 108 degrees. The kind of heat that turns air into something you push through. Maren stood behind the firing line watching Hargrove run his team through CQB drills. And he was good. Actually, genuinely, of muscle memory good. Smooth transitions. Muzzle discipline. The fluid efficiency of someone who had done this in places where getting it wrong meant body bags. His team was another story. Young. Enthusiastic. Of the sloppiness that enthusiasm and inexperience produce together. Hargrove saw it too, he corrected. Specific. Accurate. He knew what he was doing. Then he saw her walked over, stopped 3 feet away. Not quite hostile, not quite polite. The temperature of a man deciding how to categorize something. Help you with something, Master Chief. Just observing, sir. Part of my duties. You shoot, when required, expert qualification? Yes, sir. Something moved through his eyes. Skepticism dressed up as curiosity. Navy expert or real expert? She held his gaze. The qualification standards are uniform across services, sir, he snorted. Tell you what, why don't you show us? She could have declined, cited her cover, walked away, stayed invisible. But something in his tone, the particular variety of dismissal she had heard in varying forms since the first day she showed up to Bud Setch and someone said, "Why is she here?" She had been proving that tone wrong her entire adult life. Yes, sir, I'd be happy to, he almost smiled. Not kindly. 7 targets, 50 meters, full CQB sequence, 12 seconds. She stepped to the line. And here is the thing about moments like this. They don't feel significant when they happen. They feel quiet. Almost boring. Because when you are truly good at something, bone-level good, it doesn't feel like performance. It feels like exhaling. She exhaled 7 targets, 21 rounds, 9.1 seconds. She safed the weapon, handed it back, turned to Hargrove. 7 targets, each with a tight double-tap center mass, each with a single clean shot to the head, of the work of someone who had done this not hundreds but thousands of times. The silence was loud. "Lucky," he said. Finally, "Yes, sir." "Very lucky." She walked away behind her. Someone whispered, "That wasn't luck, man. That was something else entirely." She didn't break stride. She was at her terminal at 15:12 on day 5 when she went to the bathroom. 2 minutes. Maybe 3. When she came back, her secure files were gone. Not crashed. Not corrupted. Deleted from the server side. Her login still active. Of sessions still running. As if someone had reached through her open session and simply erased 3 days of transaction records. The ones that had begun flagging irregular purchase patterns in specific equipment categories. She stood very still. A coffee spill destroys a laptop. Clumsy. Deniable. This was different. Server-side deletion required administrative access, system knowledge of, and the specific motivation of someone who had just seen their trail beginning to appear in someone else's report. She looked at the soldier at the next terminal, young. Headphones around his neck. Carefully not meeting her eyes. "Did you see anyone at my terminal?" "No, Master Chief. I had my headphones in." "Probably true." She sat back down, opened a new document, started reconstructing from memory. She had a very good memory. 21 years of training it. At 2 in the morning, a knock at her door. CSM Harlan Cole stood in the hallway, 62 years old, a prosthetic left leg beneath his BDUs. The most capable man she had ever known, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had seen her light on and made a decision. "You look terrible," he said. "Thank you, Gunny." He came in, sat. They drank in the silence that exists between 2 people who have been through enough together. That silence is comfortable. "Server-side deletion," he said. "Not a question. Yes. Someone with administrative access, and a reason to stop what I was finding." She looked at him. "Gunny. Hargrove said something in the hallway yesterday. He said his father died because the Navy left him behind." Cole was still. "Someone gave him that story," she said, deliberately. "And it's not true. We both know it's not true." She paused. "Someone made sure he believed it. Made sure he had a target for 20 years of grief." She looked at Nathan's photograph on the desk. "And now someone's using that target, using his anger as a distraction while they cover their tracks." "Fenwick," Cole said quietly. "I think so. I can't prove it yet." Cole set his cup down. "The man who just deleted your files is probably the same man who's been emptying that equipment fund. And he needed the smoke screen." He paused. "Be careful, Maren." "I'm always careful." "Be more careful." He stood. Walked to the door. Stopped without turning. "He looks like Warren." "Yes," she said. "He does. That must be something." "It's something," she agreed. He left. She went back to her reconstruction. Memory by memory, transaction by transaction. She worked until 4 in the morning. The changing room at FOB Iron was unremarkable. 20 feet by 15. Concrete block walls painted institutional green. Shower stalls. Lockers. Benches worn smooth by years of use. And in the northeast corner, a security camera, recording continuously to the base server. Red light blinking. Maren had noted it on day 1. She always noted the cameras. It was 16:45 on day 7 when she pushed open the door. Most of the base was at evening chow. She needed 10 minutes. Clean up after a 12-mile ruck. Change into duty uniform. Get back to her reconstruction. The room was quiet. She opened her locker, started the ritual, methodical, precise, the meditation of order. She heard the door. And she knew before she turned, before the voices. The way you know a storm before the first drop of rain falls. The geometry of the room changed with the arrival of 3 men who were not here to change their clothes. She kept folding. "Hargrove, look what we've got." She didn't look up. "I'm talking to you, Master Chief." She stopped, set the shirt down, turned. "I hear you, Major." 6 feet away, arms crossed, the body language of a man who has made a decision. Soto behind him. Reese against the wall, already positioned in a way that wasn't quite casual enough. "Nobody can explain your purpose here," Hargrove said. "You don't train. You don't contribute to anything I can observe." His jaw tight. "You know what I think? You're a checkbox." Someone in D.C. needed the paperwork to look right. Her pulse. Steady. "My father died in 2003. His voice changed quality, of the anger underneath shifting into something rawer. Iraq. He was Army. And you know what the Navy support did when things went sideways? His eyes on hers, hard, certain. The certainty of a man who has believed something for 20 years. Of left him behind. That's the lie. She heard its shape clearly, the specific contour of a false thing. A 17-year-old boy in grief receiving a story someone had handed him deliberately. Of 20 years of rage built on a foundation that wasn't real. Not yet. Don't say it yet, Major. Her voice was level, almost gentle. She looked at the camera, made sure he saw her look at it. There's a recording light. Northeast corner. Of everything in this room is on file. I don't care about cameras, rising. I care about real operators. He shoved her shoulder. Hard, deliberate, she absorbed it. Didn't stumble. Didn't step back. Just took it. Which seemed to enrage him more than resistance would have. Because there is nothing more infuriating to a man like this than a woman who doesn't flinch. Nothing, he said. You've got nothing. Then his hands shot forward. Both of them, of around her throat. Thumbs on the trachea. Textbook grip. Her pulse didn't spike. Her mind went quiet the way it went quiet in every moment when the decision was already made, and the Basadi simply needed to execute it. She looked at the camera, of red light. Blinking good. Her left hand moved to his right elbow. Her right hand found the exact pressure point on his left wrist. She'd done this 10,000 times. In training. In darkness. In circumstances that made this concrete room feel like a pleasant afternoon. Her hips pivoted. His own momentum became the instrument. 1.8 seconds. Hargrove hit locker 7 with a sound like a gunshot in a concrete room. Maren adjusted her collar. Picked up her duffel. Walked to the door. Did not say one word. Did not look back. The door swung shut behind her. She walked back to her quarters. Sat at her desk. Looked at the time. 17:15. She started writing her incident report. Factual. Clinical. No emotion. No interpretation. Just what happened, when it happened, exactly as it happened. She filed it at 17:15, then went back to her financial reconstruction because someone inside this base had deleted her files, and that someone was going to leave a different kind of trail. She was going to find it. The rumor started before breakfast. By 0600, half the base knew something had happened in changing room B7. By 0630, the details had mutated. By 0700, of the version circulating bore about 40% resemblance to what had actually occurred, which, in Maren's experience, was average for military gossip. She heard it walking into the chow hall. Didn't slow down. Didn't change her expression. Just listened. Filed. Kept moving toward the coffee station. Version from table 3. Maren had snapped. Lost control. Screamed at Hargrove. Version from table 7. Hargrove had professionally defended himself against an unprovoked attack. Version from the younger soldiers near the window. Loud enough to be heard, but not quite loud enough to be confrontational. Diversity higher. Finally showed her true colors. Navy's going to bury it. She found a corner table. Set her tray down, and then a sound, small. A tray being placed across from her. Petra Voss sat down, didn't say anything, just sat. Eyes down. The posture of someone who had made a decision and was working up to understanding what it cost her. Maren looked at this 22-year-old, who had been sitting alone at every meal for months, who had seen something and said nothing, and was now choosing to sit across from the most unwelcome person on this base. She didn't say anything, either. They ate in silence, which was, in its own way, everything. Vivienne Marsh's office looked like a law library, had a complicated relationship with a filing cabinet. Books on a military law, stacked reports, 3 monitors, and on the wall, one photograph that didn't match the institutional beige of everything else. A young woman in uniform, captain's bars, bright eyes, Marsh's eyes, but younger, and something in the set of her jaw that suggested she had once believed very hard in things that did not return the favor. Marsh looked up when Maren knocked. Come in. Sit. She pulled up 2 files on her center monitor, set them side by side. Looked at them with the expression of a lawyer who has already done the math. Major Hargrove filed a formal complaint at 0820 this morning, alleging assault. Unprovoked attack. Yes, ma'am. Your incident report was filed at 17:15 yesterday. She tapped the screen. 19 hours earlier. Yes, ma'am. One of these accounts is false, flat, factual. 16 years of this work condensed into a statement of simple geometry, of the timeline, makes that mathematically certain. A person who files a report 19 hours before an alleged altercation does not have the profile of someone who fabricated after the fact. Maren said nothing. Marsh looked at her directly, measuring something beyond the legal facts. I've reviewed 1,143 from formal complaints in this role. I know what desperation looks like in a timeline. This isn't it. A pause. My sister was a captain, Marsh said. Her voice shifted. Still controlled, but with a different quality underneath it. Military police. 2012. She filed a harassment complaint against her commanding officer. It was reviewed by a JAG officer who owed that commanding officer a favor. Of the paperwork developed problems. My sister was medically retired 14 months later with a record that followed her. Everywhere she tried to go afterward. Maren looked at her. I became a JAG officer because of what happened to her. Because I believe this process should work. She met Maren's eyes. I'm going to request the security footage. I'm going to review it, and I'm going to make the correct determination. Not the popular one, the correct one. Something in Maren's chest eased, fractionally. The specific release of a tension you didn't fully realize you were holding until some small part of it lifted. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. Marsh looked back at her screens. Is there anything else I should know? Anything that provides additional context? Maren thought about the deleted files. Fenwick. The false account of 2003. Not enough proof yet. Nothing I can document at this time, ma'am. Marsh studied her. Reading something in that answer she chose not to press. Dismissed, Master Chief. Maren stood. Started for the door. One more thing. She stopped. Marsh's voice was quieter now. Of whatever you actually are, and I've seen enough redacted files to know your cover story is exactly that. You deserved better than this week. Maren nodded once, and left. The Siri exercise was announced at 0800 on day 8. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape. 36 hours in the Nevada desert. No GPS, no radio, 20 pounds of gear. Find your way back to FOB Iron from a drop point 42 miles out. Get caught by the OP4 team and you go to the resistance station. Which was not technically pleasant. Maren stood in formation and listened. Interesting timing. The morning after a formal complaint was filed against her. An exercise that would put her in the field with the same people. Interesting. Or deliberate. She couldn't tell yet. What she could do was prepare. She used 4 of the 6 remaining hours to review sector maps. Because Maren Reeve did not go anywhere without understanding the terrain first. This had kept her alive in Afghanistan. In 3 other countries she could not name in public. And it was going to matter here. What the maps told her, what her first week security assessment had already documented, was the water infrastructure. Every military base in the Nevada desert has the same engineering challenge of moving enough water to sustain operations through terrain that actively resists it. FOB Iron solved this with an underground pipe network, main trunk running from the eastern reservoir all the way to the central supply station, underground, of straight line. With maintenance access, hatches every 2 miles, 41 miles of invisible corridor through the desert. She memorized the hatch locations. The drop was by helicopter. The desert swallowed them one by one. Then they separated. Individual navigation. Find your own way back. Maren stood in the scrub brush for 30 seconds. Orienting, sun position, wind direction, shadow length. Then she started moving. She found the first hatch at 1450, lifted it, lowered herself in, and disappeared. The surface teams had a harder time. Reese was caught at hour 4. He'd taken the direct route. The OP4 had anticipated it. Resistance in station by 1800. Soto went wide. Added miles, added concealment. Good instincts. At hour 22, he was 9 miles out and making reasonable time. Hargrove went southeast first. The long way around. Smart avoided 3 OPR positions the direct routes ran through. Good fieldcraft. Projected return of 27 to 29 hours. Maren arrived at the main gate at 19 hours and 42 minutes. Cole was at the control station. Clipboard. Stopwatch. He looked at her. Looked at the stopwatch. Looked at her again. 1942, he said. Yes, from Delta 7, yes. A long pause. How? She told him about the pipe network. The maintenance hatches. The infrastructure mapping from week 1. Cole set the clipboard down very slowly. You used your security assessment to win a SIR exercise. I used available information to find the most efficient route. He looked at the sky, then at the ground, then back at her. The expression of a man deciding between furious and impressed, of landing somewhere in the middle. Outstanding performance, he said dryly. Best return time in this exercise's history. By approximately 7 hours. Thank you, Gunny. Don't thank me. Go eat something. She was halfway to the chow hall when her radio crackled. Cole's voice, urgent, in a very specific way. The way of someone who has received information that changes everything, Reeve. We have a problem. The problem was Ignacio Soto, harm 22, 9 miles out, moving through a dry wash at the base of a rocky escarpment. The rattlesnake had been in the shadow of a flat rock he hadn't seen until his left hand came down on the wrong side of it. Of 2 strikes. Left forearm. Western Diamondback. No radio SIR protocol. No way to call for help. He'd applied his field tourniquet above the bite site. Bought time. Then kept moving because staying still in the Nevada desert at night was worse. He'd made approximately a quarter mile in 40 minutes when the OP4 found him. Cole got the report. Medical extraction, Rigsfoot. 26 minutes out. Maren had listened to all of this in 30 seconds flat. Where, exactly? Cole gave her the coordinates. She did the math. 19 minutes on foot, running. She'd just come through that wash system. She knew the terrain. She went. She found Soto at the base of the escarpment, back against a rock. Tourniquet in place. Face pale in the specific way that venom and adrenaline and exhaustion produce together. He heard her coming, and his hand moved toward his sidearm. SIR instinct. OPF4 approach. Then he recognized her and stopped. And then he looked at her with an expression she had seen before. The expression of someone who understands they are not going to die today. Not because their situation improved, but because someone showed up, Master Chief. Soto. Tourniquet looks good. Where else does it hurt, arm? Chest a little. The venom. Spreading. Normal. Stay still. She checked the bite site. His pupils, his skin temperature. Medical is 22 minutes. You're going to be fine. You just finished the exercise, he said. You came back out here. Yes. Why? She thought about this for a moment. About all the reasons why a reasonable person might have decided. This was not her problem. Because you're out here, she said. And I had the means to reach you. The medical team arrived at 20 minutes and 14 seconds. They worked fast. Maren stepped back. Let them work. And, standing at the edge of the light, she looked out at the desert, the stars. Enormous, indifferent, of the particular vastness of a Nevada night that makes every human drama feel both very small and very significant at the same time. She thought about Nathan, who had once told her, lying in a tent in Kandahar, both of them exhausted, staring at the canvas above them. The mission is always the person in front of you. Everything else is just terrain. The helicopter came. She turned back. Hargrove was standing at the edge of the landing zone. He'd returned. 28 hours. Good time. He'd walked through the gate and been told immediately. And then he'd come here, standing at the perimeter. Watching Maren came out of the desert with the medical team. She briefed the lead medic of tourniquet placement. Symptom timeline, everything they needed. Clean, professional. Done. Then she walked past Hargrove without a word. But she felt him watching. And she felt something. A frequency shifting. Like a signal changing quality. Like the beginning of something ending. Ignacio Soto requested to see Lieutenant Cole. Marsh at 0700 the next morning. Marsh had not been expecting this. She'd been expecting legal arguments about discovery timelines. Counterbriefs. Another week of machinery before anything resembling truth appeared. She had not been expecting Soto to sit down across from her, with the posture of a man who had not slept, and had made a decision in the dark. I need to amend my statement. He said. Marsh looked at him. Said nothing. The statement I filed. About the changing room, he stopped. Breathed. The struggle of a man working against his own training, against loyalty, against 3 years of unit culture. It wasn't accurate. Master Chief Reeve didn't act Major Hargrove. He initiated the physical contact, she responded. That's what actually happened. Why come forward now, Captain? He looked at his hands. She ran back into the desert last night. For me, after what we did to her flat. Simple. She sat with me in the dark and told me I was going to be fine. And she was right, and the muscle in his jaw working. I couldn't keep being the person who let that stand. Marsh opened a new file. Start from the beginning, she said. Tell me exactly what happened, he told her everything. Petra Voss knocked on the JAG office door at 0900 of, standing in the doorway in the posture of someone using every resource they have to hold themselves very still. Because if they move, they might change their mind, ma'am. I have something to tell you. About Master Chief Reeve's files. Of Marsh set her pen down. Come in. Close the door. What Petra had seen. At 15:12 on day 5, while Maren was in the bathroom for 3 minutes, a man had walked to her terminal, entered something quickly, left not Hargrove, of Chief Warrant Officer Douglas Fenwick, 41 years old, base logistics coordinator, the man responsible for equipment fund authorization. Petra had been 3 terminals away, headphones around her neck but not on. Of she'd looked up because she'd heard movement. She'd seen Fenwick. She'd watched him touch Maren's keyboard. She'd seen his expression on his face, not anger, calculation. Someone executing a step in a plan. She'd said nothing for days. Because Fenwick outranked her significantly, and the unit culture on this base had already demonstrated its approach to people who made inconvenient observations. But she'd sat across from Maren Reeve in the chow hall while the entire base whispered. And Maren had just sat there, quiet, steady, and had then run back into the desert for a man who had lied about her. And Petra Voss had understood something that morning. You don't get to wait for someone else to be the person who does the right thing. You either are that person or you're not. She told Marsh everything. Marsh listened, filed every word, then picked up her phone and called General Harmon. Sir, we need to talk. 2 matters, both urgent, both connected. Maren learned about Fenwick on day 9. Cole told her, quietly, in her quarters at 2100, with the particular gentleness of someone handing you the piece that makes the whole picture visible. Douglas Fenwick, she said, of logistics coordinator. 14 months of small denomination transfers, through accounts coded under 4 different budget categories. Cole sat down. Petra Voss saw him at your terminal. Marsh has her statement, and Fenwick's server access logs from that afternoon have been recovered. She thought about the 3 days of records she'd reconstructed from memory, about the patterns she'd been finding, about how close she'd been without knowing it. He deleted my files because they were starting to flag his categories, she said. Yes, and then he needed you occupied. Discredited. Cole paused. He knew Hargrove's history, knew the anger was already there. He didn't create it. He just made sure it had a specific shape when it was useful to him. What did he tell him? About 2003? We don't have that yet. But we know someone fed him an account that said the Navy left his father behind. Cole's voice was careful. Of someone who had access to KIA processing paperwork in 2003. Maren looked at Nathan's photograph. He was 17 years old, she said quietly. Someone took his grief and pointed it. Yes, for 20 years he's been carrying something that wasn't true. Yes, the particular cruelty of that, the specific damage done by a lie given to someone too young and too devastated to question it, and then fed again recently by someone with a spreadsheet and a survival instinct. What Hargrove had done in that changing room was not innocent. Nothing excused it. But the origin of a fire doesn't erase the burn, and it doesn't mean the fire isn't real. But it means something. It always means something. The proceeding is scheduled, Cole said. 800. Harmon's running it personally. She nodded. Looked at her hands. I trusted the system, she said quietly. I documented, I reported. I followed every protocol, and someone still deleted my work, and 3 men still lied, and the base still spent a week. I know. Was I right to trust it? Cole was quiet for a moment. The long kind. 62 years of watching things work and work again and sometimes fail permanently. You were right to do what you did, he said finally. That's not always the same thing as the system being right. He met her eyes. But sometimes, not always, not even usually. Someone like Vivian Marsh is sitting in that jaggy office. And someone like Petra Voss walks through a door she's scared to walk through. He paused. Sometimes it's enough. She looked at him for a long time. I need it to be enough this time, Gunny. I know you do. After he left, she sat in the quiet. His photograph, his dog tags, the notebook. She opened it. Looked at the marks. She took out her pen. Made a new mark. Not a kill, Ignacio Soto. Who had lied about her, and then walked into a JAG office. and told the truth because something had shifted in him in the dark. That counted. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, lay down. The lowest her pulse had been all week. Of tomorrow the truth would have its day. She was going to let it. Of the command hearing room at FOB Iron was cold, not the temperature. The institutional chill of a space arranged very deliberately to communicate one thing. What happens here is permanent. 0800 of Nevada sun punishing through the high windows. Dust motes suspended in the light as if waiting. At the head of the U-shaped table, Brigadier General Gideon Harmon, of the face of a man who had made irreversible decisions for 30 years and carried all of them. To his right, Call, Vivian Marsh, 3 monitors, the machinery of military justice loaded and ready. To his left, CSM Harlan Cole, of Witness, Observer, someone who had seen enough to know what he was looking at. On one side of the U, 3 men in Class A uniforms, Major Beckett Hargrove, 38, jaw tight, eyes forward, of preparing for a fight he wasn't sure he could win but hadn't stopped preparing for, Captain Ignacio Soto, 35, hands folded, head slightly bowed, of the posture of a man who made a decision in the dark and was still living in its aftermath, Sergeant Calder Reese, 33, looking straight ahead, trying to be invisible opposite them, Master Chief Maren Reeve, diverse dress blues, of the formal uniform she had worn 6 times in 21 years, each time for something that mattered. And the ribbons, nobody in this room had seen them before. 7 days of working uniforms, PT gear, of the unremarkable clothing of someone here to do a job without announcing herself. But today, top row, Silver Star, Gold Star device, 2 awards, second row, Bronze Star, with Valor, 5 times, third row, Purple Heart, twice, of. Both times she had continued mission afterward. 27 ribbons total. Hargrove had a Labate commented. Nobody needed to. The visual contrast sat in the room and did its own quiet work. Harmon let the silence build. Then, of. This is a formal command hearing under Article 32, Uniform Code of Military Justice. The proceedings are recorded. They will determine whether charges are referred for court-martial. He looked at Hargrove. Major Beckett, Hargrove, of. You stand accused of assault under Article 128. False official statement under Article 107. Conduct unbecoming an officer under Article 134. Hargrove didn't flinch. How do you plead? Not guilty, sir. I acted in self-defense. Noted, of. Harmon looked at Marsh. Lieutenant Colonel, present your evidence. Of. Marsh stood, activated the wall screen, spoke in the clinical, unhurried cadence of someone who had been building toward this moment through 16 years of work, and one very specific decision to become a JAG officer, sir. Of. On the evening of Day 7, my office received a formal complaint from Major Hargrove alleging unprovoked assault by Master Chief Reeve. Filed at 0820 the following morning. Corroborated by Captain Soto and Sergeant Reese, of. She paused. Master Chief Reeve had already filed an incident report at 17:15 the previous evening. 19 hours and 5 minutes before Major Hargrove's complaint, the 2 files appeared on screen. Timestamps, of. Clear as arithmetic. One of these accounts is false. The timeline makes that mathematically certain. She looked at the screen. Just at the facts. I requested security footage from the changing room. What I'm about to show you is unedited, of. Timestamp verified. Retrieved directly from the base server, she played the footage, no commentary. Just the video. 1647, Maren alone, folding her uniform, unhurried. The behavior of someone who expected to be alone. Of 1649, the door. 3 men. Body language readable from across a room. 1650, escalation, verbal. Hargrove moving closer. 1650. 1. Maren looking directly at the camera, her mouth moving clearly. Of. Marsh froze the frame with audio. She said, Maren's voice from the footage. Calm, almost gentle. Major, there's a recording light. Northeast corner. Everything in this room is on file. Hargrove's response. Rising. I don't care about cameras. The shove the hands around her throat. 1.8 seconds. The sound of Hargrove hitting locker 7. Marsh stopped the footage. The silence was complete. 1.8 seconds, she said, of no excessive force. Minimum response necessary to break the grip. Master Chief Reeve then collected her belongings and exited. She did not say one word. She let that sit. The responding force was proportional. Of. The documentation was filed immediately. The footage corroborates Master Chief Reeve's account precisely. A pause. Major Hargrove, Captain Soto, Sergeant Reese. The statement you filed was false, Soto said quietly. I amended my statement. Ma'am. Voluntarily you did. That will be taken into account. Reese was looking at the floor. Hargrove was looking at the screen, at the frozen image of his own hands, around another person's throat, on camera, after being warned. Twice, his jaw was working. But he wasn't speaking. Marsh wasn't finished. There is a second matter, connected to this proceeding in ways this board needs to understand. She pulled up a new file of Chief Warrant Officer Douglas Fenwick, Base Logistics Coordinator. 14 months of unauthorized transfers through equipment fund accounts. Total $412,000 of distributed across 18 budget categories in amounts calibrated to remain below automatic audit thresholds. She brought up Petra's statement of Private First Class Petra Voss witnessed Fink accessing Master Chief Reeve's terminal on the afternoon her files were deleted. Her account is corroborated by server access logs recovered by this office. A pause. Of Fenwick is in custody pending formal criminal investigation. Harmon's face. Still. The stillness of a man organizing several simultaneous realizations. But sir, Marsh said, there is one more element. She looked at Hargrove. Major, are you prepared to hear it? Something moved across his face. He didn't know what was coming, but he felt it. The way you feel weather before it arrives? Yes, he said. Marsh opened the classified file. She read it carefully. The operational record. 21 years, 42 countries, 11 combat tours, each Silver Star, each Purple Heart, each line of a life spent in service to things that don't get discussed in polite company. She read without editorializing. 190 confirmed. Sting, and then Operation Falconer. March 21, 2003. Team lead, CSM Harlan Cole. Petty Officer Maren Reeve, age 22. Attached Army asset. Of Colonel Warren Hargrove. The name, his father's name, in her record. Hargrove's hands, flat on the table, pressing. The effort of staying still, of Petty Officer Reeve administered emergency hemorrhage control and evacuated Colonel Hargrove 200 meters under active enemy fire, while CSM Cole provided covering fire. Marsh's voice. Precise. Unwavering. Colonel Hargrove expired in the medevac helicopter due to blood loss. Petty Officer Reeve's actions were fully within protocol. No fault assigned. The room. Perfectly still. There is an addendum, Marsh said, of a flight crew time-stamped recording of Colonel Hargrove's final statements. She paused. Major, do you want to hear this? Hargrove looked up. His eyes were red. Not yet crying. But the redness of someone whose body was working very hard against itself. Yes, he said. Ma'am. She read it. Beckett. Tell Beckett. Tell him I'm proud. Tell him to live better than me. The silence that followed was not measured in seconds. Then Marsh said, there is a second addendum. Filed 6 weeks after Colonel Hargrove's death. Petty Officer Reeve submitted a formal request, 3 times, to make direct contact with next of kin, to relay information from his final moments. She looked up. All 3 requests were denied. Classified mission parameters of Hargrove's breath. A single audible exhale. She tried to reach you, Marsh said quietly. 20 years ago. And the system said no. She pulled up one final document. The Fenwick preliminary investigation. The account you received. The version describing the Navy abandoning your father. We have traced evidence suggesting it originated with Fenwick, who had access to KIA processing paperwork in 2003. His full motive in 2003 is still under investigation. What we know is this. 14 months ago, when Master Chief Reeve's assessment began generating reports that approached his financial activity, he needed you angry. He needed a distraction. He needed the grievance that had been sitting in you for 20 years to have somewhere to go. She closed the folder. You were not wrong to grieve your father, Major. You were lied to about why. Harmon said, Master Chief Reeve, do you have anything to add to the record? She could have stayed silent. She had documented everything. The footage said everything. Marsh had built the case with precision. She could have let the machinery finish its work, but she looked at Beckett Hargrove, this 38-year-old man with his father's jaw and his father's eyes and 20 years of loving the wrong version of a story. And she thought about a 1406 timestamp on a flight recording and 3 denied requests, and every March 21st for 20 years. She thought, Someone should have told him sooner. He deserved to know sooner. And because that someone couldn't be the 22-year-old she used to be, it was going to have to be her now. Yes, sir, she said. She looked at Hargrove, just at him. Directly, your father didn't scream. Her voice was quiet. Not performing anything. Just. True. The shrapnel took him fast and it took him hard, and there was a lot of blood, and it was my first night outside the wire, and I was 22 years old and terrified. A breath. But he didn't scream. He looked at me. A kid covered in his blood, hands shaking, and he said, "Stay calm. Do your job, Hargrove." Not moving, so I did. I put the tourniquet on. I got the pressure on the wound. Cole and I carried him to the landing zone. I held his hand on the helicopter. I told him he was going to be fine. She paused. I believed it. A breath. He squeezed my hand. He looked at me, and he said, "Your name." She stopped. Let the space around the words breathe. He said, "Beckett." He kept saying Beckett. Hargrove's shoulders shaking now, just slightly. The effort of a man working very hard against himself. I filed the request 6 weeks later. 3 times. They said no. 3 times. She looked at him steadily. "I'm sorry it took this long. I'm sorry the system." She stopped. "I'm sorry I couldn't reach you sooner." Then, quieter still, "He talked about you, even when he was fading. He said you liked fishing. He said you were stubborn like him. He hoped you'd choose something quieter. He knew you wouldn't." A pause. "He said you were the best thing he ever." She stopped. Let the rest of it stay in the air where Warren Hargrove had left it. Hargrove's head went down. Not a small movement. The full weight of a man finally putting down something he had been carrying incorrectly for 20 years. After a long moment, she said, "The message he left, the real one, was this: don't die for the mission. Live to bring your people home." The room held those words. Just those words. And the long, long silence of their absence for 20 years. Harmon spoke. "Major Beckett Hargrove. The evidence is conclusive. The footage is unambiguous. Your statement was false. Your actions were criminal." He paused. "This board finds you guilty on all 3 charges." Hargrove stood, unsteady, but upright. Normally this would result in reduction in rank and permanent removal from command track. Harmon looked at him for a long time, however. "You have been, it is now clear, deliberately manipulated by someone who used your grief as an instrument. That does not excuse what happened in that changing room. But it is context." He paused. "I am offering you a choice. Option 1, reduction to captain, 60 days restriction. Permanent removal from command." He let that sit. Option 2, reduction to captain. Immediate voluntary transfer to a forward deployed unit. You deploy. You lead. You bring your people home. Every single one. And you prove, not to this command but to yourself, that your father's sacrifice produced the officer he believed it would." Hargrove stood very straight, "Sir. I request combat deployment." Something moved across Harmon's face. Not quite approval. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has seen enough of human beings to know that what people choose in their worst moments sometimes tells you everything about who they actually are. Granted. 30 days. Then you ship. He looked at Soto. "You came forward voluntarily, with full understanding of consequences. That demonstrates integrity." A pause. "Reduction to first lieutenant. 30 days restriction, suspended. You'll work with JAG office?" He glanced at Marsh. "He's yours, Colonel. Marsh?" The micro-expression of someone actively not smiling. "Sergeant Reese, you watched. You said nothing until you had no choice. That is the smallest version of integrity. Reduction to staff sergeant. 45 days restriction." He didn't soften. "I suggest you find a larger version." Then he looked at Maren, Master Chief Reeve. This board finds no fault with your actions. Your response was proportional. Your documentation was immediate and accurate. Your conduct throughout this proceeding reflects the highest standards of military professionalism." He set his hands flat on the table. "You came here to do a job. You were assaulted. You were lied about. You had your work deleted by someone protecting a crime. And in the middle of all of that," he paused, "you ran back into the desert to save the man who helped accuse you. Because he was out there and you had the means to reach him." A pause. "On behalf of this command, I apologize that you were put in this position. You deserved better than this week, Maren." Perfectly still. "Thank you, sir." Dismissed. All of you. The hallway outside the command hearing room was long, fluorescent. The particular nowhere quality of institutional corridors that exist only to move people between places that matter. She was almost to the exit when she heard footsteps behind her, of not fast, not aggressive, just following. She stopped, turned Hargrove, standing 10 feet away, cover in his hands. No Soto, no Reese, just him, with the expression of a man who has something to say and cannot locate the beginning of it. She waited. I spent 20 years, he said. Quiet, the defensiveness completely gone. What was underneath? Younger, less certain. Closer to 17 than he'd been in a long time, believing something. And pointing it at people who, he stopped, at you. After what you actually, Hargrove, he looked at her. You were 17, she said. Someone handed you a lie when you were 17 and devastated, and had no reason to question it. She paused. What happened this week is not okay, But I understand how you got here, and those aren't the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Did he say anything else? Halting. About me. Anything else, he said. You liked fishing more than baseball. A pause. He said you were stubborn like him. He hoped you'd choose something quieter. He knew you wouldn't, and he was proud of you anyway. She looked. He was scared, but proud. Hargrove looked at the floor. He took me fishing every Saturday morning that last summer. We never talked about anything important. Just sat there. A pause. I think he knew it was the last one. I think so too, she said, and he chose to spend it with you. Not explaining, not preparing, just present. He looked up. Deploy smart, she said. Deploy careful. Bring every single one of your people back. That's how you honor him. Not by dying well, by keeping others from dying at all. A long silence. I'm sorry, Master Chief. For what he stopped, started again. I'm sorry, I know, she said. She meant it. She turned. Walked toward the exit, the door ahead. The Nevada sun beyond it, Chief. She stopped. Didn't turn, thank you, he said, for trying, 20 years ago. And, a pause. And for this, she nodded once and walked out into the light of Harlan Cole. Found her behind the equipment building, sitting on a bench that someone had placed there specifically for people who needed to exist somewhere outside of where anyone could see them. He didn't say anything. Just sat down beside her, reached into his pocket, set something small on the bench between them, wrapped in cloth that had been handled many times over many years. She looked at it, picked it up, unwrapped it, a unit patch, black circle, of silver phoenix rising from wings shaped like something classified. Latin inscription, Fidelis in Silentio. Faithful in silence, Red Squadron. Devi grew, her unit, of the years of her life that had cost the most and mattered the most and made her into the particular thing she was. Gunny, she said, I can't. You can, He looked at her with the directness of someone who has trained 1,000 operators and been genuinely impressed by 3 and is currently looking at one of those 3. You never stopped being one of us. You just went on a different mission for a while. He paused, raising Nora, healing. Finding out what's left after the uniform, she turned the patch over in her hands. 21 years, Nathan, the deployments, the choices, of the notebook and its marks. The man she'd held in a helicopter whose blood had dried on her hands, and the son she'd finally reached. 20 years late. But reached, the mission is changing, Cole said. From taking to teaching, from the field to the next generation. That's not less. That's evolution. The best operators I ever trained are the ones who learn to translate what they know into something that outlasts them. He looked at her. You're one of them, She attached the patch to her uniform. It fit like it had never left. Cole stood, faced her, and then he saluted, sharp, precise. Not superior to subordinate, equal to equal, of the respect of someone who has seen enough to know when he is in the presence of something rare. She stood, returned it. They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. Nora arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the hearing. 20 years old, civilian clothes, jeans, a jacket, Nathan's old watch on her wrist. Standing at the gate of FOB Iron with a duffel bag and the expression she had inherited directly from her father. The one that said, I made a decision and I'm here and I know what it cost and I'm not changing my mind. 72-hour liberty, she said when Maren opened the door. I took 3 buses and 1 very questionable rideshare. She held up a paper bag. I brought coffee. Maren looked at her daughter, and something in her chest, that thing she had been holding for a very long time by sheer necessity, released. She pulled Nora into a hug and held on. For a long time, Nora let her. They sat in the small room, drank the coffee, talked the way they hadn't in months, the way that had nothing to do with careful words or protective distance, or two people who loved each other trying not to cause additional pain, just talking. Eventually, Nora said, CSM Cole called me, told me what happened. All of it. Gunny talks too much. Gunny talks exactly the right amount. She looked at her mother. Nathan's eyes in her own face. Mom, why didn't you tell me what you actually were? What all of it? Because I didn't want you to feel like you had to be it. Like the path was already laid out and your only option was to, Mom? Nora set her coffee down. I'm at West Point. A pause. Yes, I chose that. I know. I chose it because of you. Her voice was direct, the directness of someone who has thought about this carefully, and is done with careful. Not the missions. Not the classified. Whatever. Because of how you are. Because you ran back into a desert for a man who lied about you. Because you sat in that chow hall and ate your oatmeal while the entire base was talking, and you didn't flinch. She looked at her. That's what I want to learn. Not the shooting. The part after the shooting, Maren looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she reached under her bunk, the footlocker, brought out something wrapped in cloth, a combat knife, handle worn smooth from years of use, of the blade inscribed in Nathan's own hand on the night before their wedding, because he was, among other things, a man who believed in marking important things. Get everyone home. She held it out to Nora. Both hands, tracing the letters. Dad, she said, and now yours, because the mission continues, not through me. Through you, through every person you lead, every life you protect. She looked at her steadily. That's what legacy actually is. Nora looked up. What if I fail? Then you own it, completely. You learn exactly what went wrong. You get back up, Maren looked at her. We don't have to be perfect, Nora. We just have to show up, and when we fall short, and we will. We don't pretend we didn't, Nora nodded, folded her fingers around the handle. Get everyone home, she said softly. Every single one. 3 years later. The Florida Keys in late afternoon. The water doing what it does here when the light is right. Going gold and copper and deep green all at once, of a color that shouldn't be possible, but happens anyway. Because the world is occasionally generous about beauty. Maren Reeve stood on the dock of the small dive operation she had built with her retirement savings, and a lot of early mornings, of 2 boats, a shed full of equipment. A sign her daughter had painted by hand, slightly crooked, that she refused to straighten. 6 students surfacing from their open water certification dive. The specific joy on civilian faces after their first successful time underwater. Beautiful form, everyone. That's a wrap. She watched them pull themselves up onto the dock. Different ages, different reasons for being here. All of them learning the same fundamental thing, that the water will hold you if you let it. That panic is the enemy. That breathing is the most important skill you will ever develop. Her phone buzzed. Nora, Mom, just got my first command assignment. Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon. Germany, shipping in 6 weeks. I wish Dad could see this. Maren typed back. He does, and he's proud. So am I. Get everyone home, baby Nora. Always. Love you. She pocketed the phone, looked out at the water. A second buzz. An email from CPT Beckett Hargrove, Chief Reeve. Rotation complete. 18 months. 3 deployments. I am writing to tell you that every single member of my unit came home. Not one KIA. Not one. I accounted for every person at every stage of every operation. I'm putting in my retirement papers. Going to teach. History and leadership. High school. I'm going to tell kids about real service. About my father. About what it actually means to get everyone home. My son was born 3 weeks ago. Warren Beckett Hargrove. I'm going to tell him about both of you. The grandfather he'll never meet. And the woman who tried to save him, and who finally delivered his last words 20 years late to the person who needed them most. Thank you for giving me back my father's story. The real one. Respectfully, CPT Hargrove. Ret. She read it twice. Let the tears come. Didn't stop them. A third email. From Soto. Accepted to law school on Colonel Marsh's recommendation. Going to spend my career making sure the right things get documented, and truth doesn't get buried by whoever finds it inconvenient. Thank you for the desert, for all of it. A fourth. From Reese. Working on a larger version of integrity, of thought you should know. And one more. From Petra Voss. Now a 2nd lieutenant. Ma'am, I've thought about that morning in the chow hall 100 times. When everyone was talking and you just sat there and didn't flinch. In every moment since where the easy thing was to stay quiet. I thought about that morning. Thank you for showing me what it looks like to just keep going. Maren read all of them, sat for a moment on the dock. She opened her notebook. Turned to the inside cover. The original 190 marks. And the 2 new added 5 more. Nora, Hargrove, Soto, Reese, Petra, every single one of them. Home, one of her students called from the dock. Is it true you were in the Navy? Like, actually in the Navy? She looked up these people. These civilians who would never know combat, learning to breathe underwater on a Thursday afternoon in the Florida Keys. Including the woman at the back of the group, pushing 70, Maren guessed, who had spent the entire dive refusing to panic even when she was clearly terrified, who had gotten back up every time the water tried to disorient her, who had this look about her, the look of someone who had survived a lot of things, who had decided, at some point that might have been recent or might have been long ago, that there was still more to learn. A long time ago, Maren said, what was it like at them all? It was an honor, she said, and it taught me the most important lesson I'll ever know. What's that? She looked out at the water, the gold light, the enormous of patient sea that had been here long before any of them. The mission is never the mission, she said. The mission is always the person standing next to you. She breathed in. 4 seconds, held it. 7, let it out. 8 of 56 beats per minute, the lowest it had been since she could remember. The ghost had come home, and she wasn't a ghost anymore. Just Maren, standing on a dock in Florida, watching the light change on the water. Finished.